Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel Asterisk in the late 18th century. While the American colonies were revolting against British rule, Nova Scotia found itself caught in the turbulence of revolution, despite remaining technically loyal to the Crown. Between 1776 and 1784, a quiet but consequential rebellion simmered within the province. While it never erupted into a full-scale war like in the 13 colonies, Nova Scotia was divided between those who sympathized with the American revolutionaries and those loyal to Britain. The province's strategic location made it a hotbed of tension. American privateers harassed its coastal towns, and many residents, especially among the planters and Acadians, expressed Republican sympathies. Among the most overlooked elements of this period were the struggles faced by Black loyalists formerly enslaved Africans who had fought for the British in exchange for freedom. After the war, thousands settled in Nova Scotia, particularly in Shelburne and Birchtown. But far from finding peace, they encountered severe racial hostility. In 1784, one of the first race riots in North America broke out in Shelburne, as white loyalists attacked Black communities, furious about economic competition and racial integration. This rebellion of social and racial dynamics has been largely forgotten in Canadian collective memory, overshadowed by grander tales of nation-building and British victory. Yet it laid bare the fractures economic, racial, and political that existed even in loyal provinces. Nearly a century later, in the heart of the Red River Valley, a very different kind of uprising would test the bounds of the emerging Canadian Confederation. In 1869, the Métis descendants of Indigenous and European settlers found themselves confronting a Canada eager to expand westward. The Hudson's Bay Company had sold Rupert's Land to the Dominion of Canada, but no one had consulted the people who lived there. When Canadian surveyors arrived to divide up Métis lands, it ignited fierce resistance. At the center of it was Louis Riel, a charismatic Métis leader who saw the threat not just as a land dispute, but as an existential challenge to his people's identity, language, and rights. The Métis established a provisional government and halted Canadian expansion, demanding negotiations on their terms. Though Riel's government executed a Canadian loyalist, Thomas Scott, causing outrage in Ontario, the resistance ultimately led to the Manitoba Act and the creation of the province of Manitoba negotiated compromise. Yet Riel was forced into exile, branded a traitor. Today, historians increasingly recognize the Red River resistance not as treason, but as a foundational moment in Canadian history, a grassroots assertion of Indigenous and settler rights that helped shape the nation's boundaries and governance. Far from an isolated uprising, it was a declaration that Canada's western expansion could not happen without consent or consequence. The Northwest Rebellion of 1885 marked the second major uprising led by Louis Riel, who had returned from exile, to once again champion the rights of the Métis and Indigenous peoples in Western Canada. Since the Red River resistance, the Métis had been steadily pushed further west, their land rights ignored and their culture increasingly marginalized. Indigenous nations already suffering from starvation due to the disappearance of the bison and government neglect were also growing desperate. Tensions escalated when the Canadian government failed to address petitions from the Métis about land claims and protection of their communities. Riel formed a provisional government in Batashi, Saskatchewan, and led a resistance that culminated in several armed conflicts, the most significant being the Battle of Batashi. The rebellion was crushed by federal troops, and Riel was arrested, tried for treason, and hanged. His trial polarized the country, viewed as justice in Ontario, but as martyrdom in Quebec and among Indigenous peoples. The rebellion's suppression led to harsher assimilation policies, the expansion of the Northwest, mounted police, and a renewed push to erase Indigenous autonomy. Yet it also cemented Riel as a symbol first of resistance, later of reconciliation, whose legacy continues to shape national identity. Nearly half a century earlier, The rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada in 1837 to 1838 had rocked the British colonial foundations of what is now Ontario and Quebec, led by William Lyon Mackenzie in the English-speaking Upper Canada and Louis-Joseph Papineau in the predominantly French Lower Canada. The uprisings were driven by political frustration. Both colonies were controlled by elite cliques known as the Family Compact and Chateau clique that monopolized power and resisted calls for democratic reform. Economic hardship and cultural tensions further fueled resentment. Though the rebellions were poorly organized and quickly crushed militarily, their impact was profound. British authorities, alarmed by the unrest, commissioned Lord Durham to investigate. His report recommended the unification of the Canadas and the establishment of responsible government, laying the foundation for modern parliamentary democracy in Canada. These failed revolts thus succeeded politically, showing that change often requires pressure, even if it's not immediately victorious. By the early 20th century, rebellion in Canada took on new forms, such as labor strikes. One of the most overlooked but significant was the Vancouver Island coal miners' strike of 1912–1914. In an era where working conditions were brutal, wages low, and unions suppressed, coal miners in British Columbia organized a massive walkout demanding safety reforms and recognition of their union. The response from the government and mine owners was swift and violent. Strikebreakers were brought in, homes were evicted, and the militia was deployed. Violent clashes erupted in places like Nanaimo and Ladysmith, and martial law was declared. While the strike ended without immediate gains, it spotlighted the growing power of organized labor and set the stage for future labor rights in Canada. It also redefined rebellion, not as a military act against the state, but as a struggle against economic oppression and for human dignity. Taken together, these rebellions spanning centuries, peoples, and motivations highlight a deeper truth about Canadian history. These were not isolated or fringe events, but grassroots movements driven by real grievances: the fight for land, fair governance, cultural recognition, and workers' rights. They challenged the dominant narratives of Canada as a peaceful and orderly society, revealing instead a history marked by contestation and resistance. The legacy of these uprisings lives on in modern debates around Indigenous sovereignty, economic justice, and democratic reform. Recognizing them forces us to confront uncomfortable truths that many of the rights Canadians enjoy today were hard-won through defiance, not granted freely. History, after all, is shaped by the stories we choose to tell, the ones we choose to forget. These forgotten rebellions offer more than just footnotes. They are central to understanding who we are as a nation. As we revisit these moments, we're invited not just to learn, but to question. Had you heard of these rebellions before? Which one challenged your view of Canadian history the most? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore more untold stories in our related videos. Louis Riel, Hero or Traitor? Indigenous Resistance in Canadian History and Canada Before Confederation. The Untold Stories.